400 million people, more than the population of the US and Canada combined. That's how many millennials you'll find in China. So how are China's young adults changing their country? I'm Untitled, and this is The Heat. China's young adults, those born between 1980 and 2000, are ready to take on the world. At 400 million strong, they make up a massive group with major purchasing power and social impact. They're also a generation that has seen their country rise to global superpower status in the span of a lifetime. A new book, Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World, seeks to explain the attitudes and experiences of China's millennials. The author, Zak Dychtwald, lived and traveled around China gathering stories for the book. He joins us right here in the studio now. Zak, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
As I said, 400 million millennials, or young people born after 1980 in China. Let's look at the big picture. Your book focuses on this generation. What impact are they having in the country?
The impact is massive, not just within the country, but internationally as well. So that 400 million number, just for context, I'm a millennial, I'm an American millennial. There's only 80 million of us. So there are 5 times more in China. What you're looking at is if you're selling or buying cell phones, solar panels, or soda internationally, this young generation is going to be redefining your industry, most likely. They have purchasing power that far exceeds what I call old China. And people are having to start to pay attention, not just to their political leanings, their economic proclivities, but also what they want, what they feel, what they dream about. And it's those intangibles that I try to focus on in this book.
Now, you lived in China, you studied in China. What led you to this interest in the millennials in China?
Well, as goofy as this sounds, it started with an interest in science fiction. When I was at Columbia deciding where to study abroad, I figured I could go to Europe and study history, or I could go to China and see where everyone was saying the future was happening. I went to Hong Kong, traveled extensively through mainland, and felt strongly that the China I was experiencing, seeing, tasting, feeling for myself was worlds different than the China that was being described to me in the media. And again, this felt like the difference not only between old China and young China, but also between these macro political and economic stories versus the heartbeat of the country.
When you say science fiction, were you seeing a future that you didn't expect, or?
I was seeing something that I don't think anyone expected. You know, there's this idea that modernization inevitably means westernization. And when you talk to young people, they have such a strong sense of self that you realize that as they modernize, as China becomes wealthier, as China enters the 21st century and beyond, they don't necessarily just want to become like millennials in the United States. So paying attention to those identity questions actually informs the political and the economic decisions of this young generation.
But there's so much different about this generation, not just in China, but around the world. This is the tech generation, isn't it? But the subtitle of your book, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. Why restless?
Because they're defining their country's identity. You know, this old generation in China was a subsistence-driven generation. They were deciding what to eat. How do they secure shelter for themselves, for their family? This young generation is the first generation in modern China that gets to decide or gets to answer not just those subsistence questions, but rather, who do I want to be? What do I stand for? What do I want for myself, my family, my country? I often describe this young generation as being stuck between 2 tectonic plates. On one side, you have what it's always meant to be Chinese, this really dense sense of culture, Confucianism, family-oriented. On this other side, you have the pressures of modernity, you know, what a house costs, what an apartment costs, education. And these 2 tectonic plates are grinding against one another. At this fault line is this young generation sort of deciding where this new identity is going to set. With that comes a lot of opportunity, excitement, but also an enormous amount of restlessness.
Is it radical change in your view?
It is certainly radical change.
Because as you point out, there is also the history of China, a very rich history, a rich culture, a rich tradition. They still subscribe to that, though, don't they?
Certainly, there's this sense that they don't want to just westernize as they modernize.
Right.
But what they've witnessed is absolutely radical change. So if you're well, first, in my lifetime, I've watched our per capita GDP in the United States increase 2.5 times. So just the quality of life in the United States increased 2.5 times, which is remarkable for a developed country. If you're my same age in China, my friends in China have witnessed their country, their per capita GDP increase 25 times. This is without equal across the world stage. India is less than 5, and all the other BRICS nations are all under 5. What they've witnessed in their lifetime, this rags to riches story, is without parallel on the world stage, and they feel that exceptionalism. They're proud of that.
Let's talk about some of the traditions that this new generation still stick with. I mean, they're very simple things like sharing a meal, buying a car, buying an apartment.
Sure.
Why is that different?
Well, you've seen the evolution of some of these original ideas. So in China, there's this idea that you should settle down soon and that you should care for your parents. It's 孝顺, means filial piety. I think it's a terrible translation because I would never be like, hey, I'm going to go be filially pious to my dad.
Right.
But in China, it's an everyday decision. It's an everyday idea. A big part of that has to do with getting married and then being able to take care of your parents. But because of China's demographic upturn, it used to be that you had a lot of kids and very few old people. As recently as 1950, the average life expectancy in China was only 36. So you didn't retire, you died. If you were a kid, trying to take care of your parents is relatively easy. Now, because of the one-child policy and a tremendous longevity revolution, that demographic pyramid has inverted. So as a child, as a young man or woman who wants to be a good person, who wants to be 孝顺, who wants to be filially pious, it's extremely difficult because the price of things has increased at such an amazing rate.
Right.
And people are living to such an incredible age. Plus, I'm a single child. How do I take care of my parents? How do I be a good child? How do I be a good person?
Of course, the other thing is that there's been this great movement to the cities in China, urbanization. That must affect what millennials do as well.
Enormous. I mean, it used to be that you would move down the block from your parents. It wouldn't even be a block. You'd get a plot of land right next to them, and that's when you would become an adult. In China, they used to run off of 反哺模式. It means the return and feed model. The idea was for parents, they would take care of their kids until they were ready to leave the nest, and then that baby bird, once they grew older, would come back and look after their parents. Because of urbanization and because of the one-child policy, all of these kids, all these young people are moving to the cities. And so looking after your parents, being a good child, becomes incredibly difficult. Plus, you know, if your entire childhood has lived out on the farm versus in the city, you have an entirely different worldview. This young generation is the first urban generation, not just in China, but really across the world.
Now, something that you'd see all over China, this tech generation, is the fact that they all have cell phones. 90% of them have cell phones, according to some figures. You call them digital natives.
Well, you know, I don't mean to knock the United States, but my friends who come and study abroad in the United States feel like we're actually 3 to 5 years behind in our tech space, particularly the mobile space. Just through WeChat, for instance, you know, if you and I go out for a meal, I can call an Uber through WeChat, I can message you through WeChat, we can video chat beforehand, I can book our food, I can pay for it, and then if one of us has a little bit too much to drink, I can order what's called a daijia. It's someone who will roll up on a scooter and drive your car home for you so you don't have to drunk drive. I still have not left the app. Their tech ecosystem is moving at such a fast rate that with, you know, I'm from the Bay Area, with great respect to Silicon Valley, there's a lot of innovations that I think we could actually learn from.
It's almost as if the smartphone is an extension of their personalities.
Absolutely. You know, they call it the, what is it? 看脸的时代, right? It's the face-centric society. It's this idea that, you know, what we're putting out into the world, again, WeChat is like Facebook and Instagram plus a million other apps put together. So what we're putting out into the world, what we're showing everyone about ourselves, you know, people are spending so much time on their phones that it does become the dominant interaction with not just our friends, but also our parents, also our relatives in faraway places.
So they have this amazing relationship with technology, a dependence on technology, really. How does it affect the country and, I guess, the world?
Well, you're starting to see this interesting homogenization, if you will. You know, China is a very regional place. There are technically 56 different ethnicities and usually a different dialect to go along with that. There's actually far more of that. From Chongqing to Chengdu, you'll get radically different, not radically different, you'll get different dialects. With the internet, with meme culture, with WeChat, you're starting to see the spread of information, not just within provinces, but all throughout the country. So if I'm in Harbin and you're in Chengdu, on different sides of the country, we're often seeing and digesting similar material. What that means is rather than region to region causing the largest differences in points of view, you're seeing tier to tier. So people in the first tier cities have a radically different point of view than people in third tier cities, and people in second tier cities. And then even more different than people out in the countryside. This tech generation has this ability to communicate across time and space that you really can't compare to any other place in any other moment in history.
Right, talking about communication, you make an interesting observation here, and that is many of them are one-child families. They come from one-child families. You call it the lonely generation.
Yeah.
That there is a need to connect because they grew up alone.
Absolutely. You know, there's this idea about the single-child generation in China. They call them 小皇帝, little emperors. But this young generation, they do, because of that 4-2-1 demography, receive far more attention, far more resources from the family. With that comes an enormous amount of pressure. Pressure to perform in school, pressure to get into college, pressure to get a good job, pressure on the marriage market afterwards. There's a lot of loneliness with that. You know, you've never felt lonely until you've taken the subway in Beijing or Chengdu or Chongqing in Shanghai in the morning, and you realize that you were just one person trying to get ahead in China's roiling economy and society. With that comes a tremendous want to connect. You start to see in each different city little clubs form, you know, a biking club, you know, clubs formed around hobbies. Again, this is the first generation that really has the luxury of hobbies in quite the same way.
You use the term little emperors. Are they spoiled?
You know, they do receive a tremendous amount of attention, but I think the more defining characteristic is pressure. I was a teacher for a very brief stint when I first got to China, and I had a class of 5-year-olds who were, there's about 6 of them in the class. At the very back of the class, there were 12 parents and then 24 grandparents watching these 5- and 6-year-olds every time they toggled a microscope or tapped on a keyboard. Every single move, every single gesture is scrutinized. At the end of the class, one of my students, one of my favorite students, I heard him wailing out of the side of the corner of the room. I go and ask what's going on, and his mom is showing him flashcards, microscope, amoeba, words we had gone over that day. I asked her, I didn't assign any homework, what's going on? She said, Jianguo, my son, is going to have to take the Gaokao, the college entrance exam, in 13 years. I'm trying to give him the edge.
And that is a very difficult exam, isn't it?
It's a very difficult exam. I often say that the project of childhood is different in China. When I was having sleepovers, playing video games, even doing my extracurricular activities that our colleges frankly value, my peer in China was studying. It's a different culture, all geared towards, especially until they turn 18, the Gaokao, the college entrance exam.
Zak, stay right there. We're going to take a break right now. Coming up, we'll be joined by a Chinese journalist and a researcher for more on China's next generation. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.